Can I get started? I assume I can get started. Yes. Welcome, everybody. This is Brian Burgoon. I'm the director of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Amsterdam. And we are holding the first session for this year of our series of discussions or series of presentations called the Great Thinkers Series. And the big idea of the Great Thinkers Series is something I'll tell you about in just a moment. But understand that we're here to listen to Marco de Brömmelstroet, who's going to tell us about the work of, and the contributions of Donella Meadows. And this is the first of our 2020 Great Thinkers presentations. And it's also the first time that we're doing this via Zoom as opposed to a live presentation. Sadly, we are still constrained by Corona and all its inconveniences. We're constrained from any kind of live event, even a mixed one. So I'm really grateful that we can do this via Zoom, thanks to the contributions and work and sponsorship of Spy25, and also the hard work of Sada Runderkamp from the AISSR office and Avi Royakkers from Spy25. We're going to get started with this Great Thinker series. Let me tell you about what it is. This is a series that we set up a few years ago to discuss and present the work to a broad social science audience, and in fact, to anybody who's interested in the social sciences, the work of key great thinkers, dead or alive, people who've had a substantial influence on the way we think about social life, political life, economic life. And the way it works is that each of our scholars within our research community has a series of great thinkers in their own work, on their bookshelves, on their computer, who they consult and are inspired by when they think about their own scholarship. And these are people who they not only think about for their own scholarship, but who they would like to share with fellow scholars and people in the broader world who care about the world of ideas, as people who are great thinkers, people who've made major contributions to the way we understand the world. And that includes a lot of, the most famous names in the social sciences, in every subfield of the social sciences. And we've had sessions on, Foucault and Marx and Adam Smith, Karl Polanyi, Hannah Arendt, Mary Robinson. We've had tons of really important scholars be presented. Sometimes those presentations are very critical. So the great thinker is somebody who is indeed very influential, but is also described in terms that are critical by the presenter. But very often they are presentations where the real contributions, positively and negatively, are put on display and discussed. So today we're continuing that tradition, and the great thinker who is going to be presented today, so to speak, is the late Donella Meadows, who most of you may not know as a social scientist, but she's actually somebody who's made one of the biggest impacts on the social sciences in the last 50 years through her work with the Club of Rome, the work on environmental governance and environmental threats. As a scientist, talking about what is important for environmental stewardship, she's become a major thinker, I think, for all the social sciences. And to see how that is true, we're going to listen to a presentation by Marco de Brömmelstroet, who's a professor in the Department of Geography, Planning, and International Development Studies. He's one of the leaders, senior people within the program group, the AISSR program group within that department, called the Urban Planning Department. And Marco was recently named as the cycling professor, essentially. That's the informal reference he gets imposed upon him. But Marco is a major scholar within urban planning, thinking about how to redesign and think about the future of environmental governance and planning, really inspired by a lot of the ideas that we're going to hear about today, the work from the Club of Rome, among others. I'm not going to say anything more about either Donella Meadows or Marco, but I do want us to all welcome Marco to Brömmelstroet. Marco is going to talk to us for about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Marco, take it away.
Well, thank you, Brian, for this this very kind introduction, and thank Spuit 25 for making all of this happen in these trying times. And I already wanted to respond to the imposed name of cycling professor upon me, because it really relates all to the talk that I'm going to give, because it was not imposed upon me. I imposed it on myself. And why did I do that? This is all already embedded in the quotes that we see here. One of the central quotes that I use by Donella Meadows, because she made me realize that the language we use, so the words that we use, are not only a means to describe reality. They are not only a mirror of reality, but they determine the reality that we see and the actions that we take. So by imposing the name cycling professor on myself, I think 6 to 7 years ago, especially on social media, I think it for a large part defined who I am and how I am seen today. So this is for me the key starting point, and also why I wanted to, after being invited to this podium, to talk especially about Donella Meadows. Very scary. It's very scary to present a great thinker. It's scary, especially if you know that there are many colleagues in the room or in the Zoom, and it's scary to do this in a digital format. But luckily, I'm going to make, of course, we have 25, 30 minutes to talk about this great thinker with all her work. So I have to make a simplified model of Donella Meadows. It's impossible to talk about the full richness of her life. But luckily, Donella Meadows, if she would have been alive and watching this, she would have been very empathic with this process of simplification. Because this is basically the key point that I will talk about in the coming minutes, is how she became aware of the role that simplification and in terms of language, modeling, system dynamics plays in our understanding of the world. And she became, I think, in the process, very empathic also to that process. So let me start with how she would describe herself. This is from an interview, one of the last interviews she gave, which is published on the website donellameadows.com. And she talks about herself in the following way. I'm an ex-biophysicist, opinionated columnist, perpetual fundraiser, fanatic gardener, opera lover, baker, farmer, teacher and global gadfly, who lives on a sheep farm and writes on a Macintosh computer with a Buddha sitting on top of it, a cat on her lap, and a dog at her feet. Whoa, that's a pretty rich image that we already get. And I think that's important to keep reminding ourselves during this presentation that I am going to simplify her within this complex description of herself. As already said by Brian, I think if people know the name of Donella Meadows, they probably know her as the lead author of the Limits to Growth report, published in the 70s commissioned by the Club of Rome. If people know her a bit more in depth, they also know her for her work in system dynamics. So she was she was trained as a biophysicist, and as such joined the team of J. Forrester at MIT in the end of the 60s. And that team basically popularized systems thinking. So this talk will not be so much about her environmental backgrounds, but much more about systems thinking. And again, I refer to Donella Meadows herself, who introduces why she was so interested in joining that team. So this is how she describes system dynamics. System dynamics is the opposite of science, which is reductionism, taking everything apart and looking at the pieces. Systems is putting everything together and looking at the whole and how things interact. The behavior of a system cannot be known just by knowing the elements from which a system is made. So, as our world continues to change rapidly and become more complex, systems thinking will help us manage, adapt, and see the wide range of choices we have before us. So in a way, I think this is a response in the around the 70s to a specific way that scientific knowledge was used in policy making around the world. But I think also increasingly, I think this is still very much alive and kicking today as well. And what I learned from her, and that's also what I want to show you, is how she started out by using the system dynamics thinking first as an activist, then as a very cynical reviewer of the role of science and models in policy making, and finally in a very reflexive and positive, empathic way. So one other great thinker that I would have loved to discuss was James Scott, and I use this example as positioning sort of the other way of seeing the role of science in policy making. So this is an example from Seeing Like a State, a book published by James Scott, and I think many of you know. I couldn't see if he was already discussed as a great thinker. If not, I'm highly recommending his work for follow-ups. And he writes in his book about high modernism and criticizes high modernism. The idea that scientific knowledge, and a very specific kind of scientific knowledge, a very technocratic understanding of the world, and how that appropriated large domains of life and even of city and urban planning. And I really like this example that he gives about how this worked in forestry. So on the left here, we see a forest in its full complexity. So a forest is a self-contained, self-managed system, and as such very successful. And James Scott discusses how scientific forestry started to simplify that forest, and especially around the idea to optimize a forest for wood production, which in itself, as I think everybody would agree, is a noble goal in itself. But as he already shows, by bracketing all complexity of the functioning of this forest, this eventually led to the breakdown of large ecosystems as the forest was, because we moved largely to forests on the right. And I think many of us will recognize these kinds of forests across the Netherlands. I see them a lot when I go on hiking tours in Germany, where forests became production forests. And as such, you can question if they still can be considered forests. So what he discusses and shows is the first slide I showed, with how language is not only a mirror of reality. The scientific language of describing a forest in optimizing it for wood production in the hands of an actor like the state actually can result in creating the reality that we are describing as such. And this is interesting for many reasons. First of all, because we have all these external effects, extinctions of species, reduction of wildlife habitat, and so on and so forth. But as the book clearly shows, in the end, seeing the system in such a simplistic way even led to the reduction of wood production, because these forests became incredibly vulnerable for all kinds of threats. So that's, I think, sort of the position in the 70s, the dominant way of thinking that Donella Meadows and her team at MIT started to question. So let's go and take a look at what they produced around that time.
It's not some science fantasy effect from 2001. This electronic display, emanating from Australia's largest computer, is a picture of the condition, past, present and future of planet Earth. The program was originally devised by a scientist working from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Jay Forrester. It was developed under the auspices of the Club of Rome by an MIT research team to present a complex model of the world and what we humans are doing to it. The program, called World 1, doesn't pretend to be a precise forecast. What it does for the first time in man's history on the planet is to look at the world as one system. It shows that Earth cannot sustain present population and industrial growth for much more than a few decades. It shows that simply cleaning up our car exhausts and making some small effort to limit our families simply isn't enough. It's like an electronic guided tour of our global behaviour since 1900 and where that behaviour will lead us. Well, This is the printed version of what we've just seen on the television screen. What looks at first to be just a maze of computer characteristics is really a system of very simple graphs, which back here, less than it was in the year 1900. And at this stage, around about the year 2040, 2050, civilized life as we know it on this planet will cease to exist. Well, hopefully, of course, it won't be allowed to happen. But it's taken this kind of shock treatment to nudge governments into doing something, and slowly we are. We're starting to clean up our atmosphere. We're starting to recycle our rubbish. We're doing something positive about population control. But so far, our efforts have really been just a drop in the ocean.
So the report produced by the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, as discussed in this television item from the 70s, was a shock treatment. And the shock here was indeed showing that the way that we were looking at the world, looking at the specific domains, looking at the problems that arose, were actually all intertwined into this huge system that we call Earth. And what is also very important, as you heard this reporter say, is that it was not. The idea was not that this computer model, World One, was reproducing the Earth. It was, by definition, a simplification. It used system dynamics to show that all these things are intertwined. What I also find, if I look at these graphs, what I find quite peculiar is that somehow 2020 seems to be always on top of the peak of the world, and we will only go down from there. So that's something we might want to discuss later in the chat. Well, as I said, important here was this the shock treatment showing, basically giving a dire warning to policymakers that problems that we were facing were not going to be sustainable over the long run. While looking backwards, 50 years, it was 50 years ago in the 1970s, we can wonder if the shock treatment really worked, or if we would still be able to give a similar shock treatment to the politicians of today. So this model is. So we see here the outcome of the model, right? So we see here all these graphs, and he's representing them on this dot matrix printer plots. But it's very important, I think, if we want to understand what Donella Meadows' contribution was, to understand what was going on beyond or within that model. And there's actually a very cool system online. Somebody built this based on the work by Donella Meadows. So I want to give you sort of a crash course in system dynamics. So let me see if we can make that work. So system dynamics is actually very simple, and that's the beauty of it. So it's not a very complicated computer model that you need. It is just a way to structure our thinking, and allows us to make our thinking explicit and to show us the systems that we actually use in our daily lives. So a very simple example here is an example of showing what it means if something has a reinforcing feedback system and how that leads to exponential growth. A key item in the limits to growth report, the idea that things with exponential growth quite quickly run over the limits, and extending the limits doesn't really help if you don't sort out the underlying exponential growth. So here we have a simple variable, the number of chicken, and we can add a very simple second variable to this system model. And that would be the number of eggs. Okay, so that's pretty easy to understand. It's also easy to understand how these things relate. So if the number of chicken increase, there's a positive relation with the number of eggs. But of course, if the number of eggs increase, most of my students are able to point out that also that means that the number of chicken will increase. And this is a simple version of a reinforcing feedback loop that leads to exponential growth. So I can show this by running the model, so to say. So if the number of chicken goes up, the number of eggs goes up, and because of that, the number of chicken goes up, the number of eggs goes up, and this goes into infinity. if we discuss this, and I hope that you're in your room already thinking, but wait a minute, this is way too simplistic. This is not in reality, because otherwise the world would have been taken over by chicken, and it didn't. So there has to be other things. So this is just the starting point of thinking, because easily we can add, for instance, a third variable. So let's assume that we are modeling a farm, and on the farm there is a road, and we have road crossings. We can easily say that if the number of chicken increase, the chicken go out further for their food, and because of that, the amount of road crossings will also increase. So there's again a positive relation. But if the number of road crossings increase, something peculiar happens, because then not the number of chicken increase, but decreases because they get hit by cars. So that's a negative relation. Now, and if we now start the model again, you start seeing that this is what is called in system dynamics a balancing feedback loop. So adding this leads to sort of a self-regulation in the system that in the long run you would see a graph that would not be an exponential growth graph, but a sort of self-balancing graph. Okay, so this is a very simplistic model, but you could already start thinking how this would help us think about a forest. And a forest with all these different feedback loops self-organizing itself into a certain balance. And it also helps us to understand what happens if we take out one of these feedback loops. Maybe because we want more wood production, we have to take out certain types of low-hanging trees or bushes. Okay, so that's that's a very simple, you can use the system. I list them in the end on my final slide. I really advise you to do it and to play around with it. It's really fun, but it also helps you to understand what system dynamics is. Because, of course, when you start modeling the world, it becomes much more complex. But the complexity here is not the complexity in terms of scientific complication. It's just adding feedback loops on feedback loops creates overviews like this. So this is only a part of the model of World 1 that you can access. It's actually you can order floppy disks with the original program still. So if you have a floppy disk machine somewhere, it might be fun to do so. But of course, we also still do that today. System dynamics is still used a lot, and this is an example of using it to understand child obesity. And again, it's not pretending to be a full model of reality, but it is helping us to understand all the influences of the social and also, in this case, spatial world on something like child obesity, which makes us aware that simple interferences in such a system are bound to create all kinds of perverse effects. So that brings us to, in this case, 30 years later. Donella Meadows and her team worked on this. They became the report became quite famous. Limits to Growth is used, discussed, sold a lot in many languages. It's used to fire up all kinds of debates. But if we look into the work that Donella Meadows is writing 30 years later, she's actually quite disappointed in how this report played a role in creating a completely different way of understanding the world. And this Beyond the Limits book is one way that she deals with that disappointment. Partly by saying, well, what we did, one of the things she learned was that what they presented was a dire warning, and that led to a sort of paralyzation, because it didn't represent the idea that you could use system dynamics in sort of an empowering way to actually think about how you could change these dynamics. So it was created, or it was sold as an idea of, okay, this is where we are running into, sort of the end of the world, the end of the world warning. And one of the quotes from this book I want to share with you is that Donella Meadows writes the following: "The way it is usually told, the message everything is connected to everything else is not fun to hear. It is intended to cause repentance and reformation. More often, of course, it causes guilt, fear, and an uncontrollable urge to avoid environmentalists. What we are rarely told is that solutions are as interconnected as problems. One good environmental action can send out waves of good effects, as impressive as the chain of disasters that results from environmental evil. So if limits to growth is a dire warning, beyond the limits is a call to action. So this book is much more, the subtitle is Confronting Global Collapse, Envisioning a Sustainable Future. So the book is much more about, okay, what could we do now to actually avoid running into the limits? And again, a keen eye has already observed that again, 2020 is the turning point of, in this case, the third version of the model, World 3. So then we get in the phase of her career where I think we could summarize as that she became almost cynical in terms of the amount of change that could be achieved. Very disappointed in the influence of the presented insights, of the role that academics actually play. And there are a number of interesting publications that I will discuss before we get to the more reflexive, positive stage. One of the key ideas here is represented in this quote by Donella is the scarcest resource is not oil, metals, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It's our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other and to seek the truth rather than seek to be right. So this represents for me sort of a almost cynical idea of becoming aware that despite all the effort and being right in that sense with the models and the systems thinking, in the end nothing changed, and also becoming cynical about herself in the sense that she might have made that mistake as well, rather trying to seek to be right instead of listening and learning from each other. So this is actually a book, but I read it as an article, The Electronic Oracle. And preparing this lecture, I became aware that I read this. This is my first encounter with Donella Meadows' work, and I read it when I was researching the role of computer models in my PhD in policy making. And it's a really funny article, so I really advise everybody to read it. But it's also very cynical. So one quote from this book is as follows. The models that we produced improved or changed the visible functioning of the world only marginally, if at all. Even the functioning of the parts of the world the models were directed towards. The main impact was on a vital but immeasurable part of the system, the world of ideas. The models legitimated, publicized, opposed, or made concrete some major old or new ways of thinking about the systems we live in. They enhanced the mental models of the modelers. They were clear reminders that the world is complex. They contributed to the debate, they did not end it. So one thing that I got out of this paper was the idea that the process of learning is not so much in using the model in a document, in a report, but in the process of making the model itself. And more we now have the tools to make that process much more inclusive. So this is already turning from cynical to a more practical and pragmatic way of using system dynamics. In this paper, and that's where I think it's quite funny, she discusses clients, and I would say clients in this case are mostly policymakers and modelers. And I would say if you read this paper, you can see modelers as scientists. So it also says a lot about us. We also produce models in our research in the social science department. And we also often get frustrated by the fact that our understanding of the world is not being used by those clients, in this case policymakers. And she presents her clients as rude boors. Making models for politicians is casting pearls before swine. The policy world is irrational or even systematically corrupt. Clients just want to hear what they already think. And then she comes with three sort of rules of thumb to use if this is something that you think and your role as a modeler or as a scientist. And the first is prostitute yourself. The second, avoid politicians. Make the general public your audience and learn to exist on very little money. Or three, go into a more promising profession. Sounds familiar? I really think that this doesn't only go for modelers, but it can be seen as a general complaint about also the way that we tend to do our work and mechanisms that lead us to that. Because she also gives us a mirror. She sees modelers here as clowns. again, scientists as clowns. Modelers are often ignored because they deserve to be. They are starry-eyed idealists with no understanding of how the world really works. They create mathematical monsters that require continuous feeding with zillions of senseless numbers and large flows of money. They never address vital issues. Modelers talk a fancy language that makes everyone else feel inferior. But when you press them for a translation, they never tell you anything you did not already know. The advice to the modeler: work on your client's problems, not your own. Stop being so pretentious. If you cannot do those things, go into a more promising profession. And for the client, treat modelers as children. Keep them under tight control. So here's some advice for us, I think, to internalize. But as promised, we now go into more the late phase, I would say, of her career, and where it really inspired me was the more reflexive work that she did, because she basically took her own advice and she went from science into become a column writer, a journalist, because she said, well, if I want to change the world, I need to change the way people think, and the mass media is the way to go. So she found for herself a way to make a difference, and I think that's for me very inspirational. So some quotes that come from the work in her columns. So this one I already covered a bit, but she here puts the criticism directly on herself. We were the best global citizens we know how to be, the environmentalist, and we were a pain in the neck. We regarded most of the people around us as unaware, unconsciously wrecking planetary destruction for short-term gratification. We separated ourselves from them. It didn't occur to us that setting up us versus them and right versus wrong categories might be the surest way of all to wreak planetary destruction. Unsustainability does not arise out of ignorance, irrationality, or greed. It is largely the collective consequence of rational, well-intended decisions made by people caught up in systems, ranging from families and communities to corporations, governments, and economies, that make it difficult or impossible to act in ways that are fully responsible to all those affected in the present and future generations. So it's quite almost cynical and depressive or nihilistic about the role of her work, and at the same time very promising and empowering. Because if you can make those systems more visible to everybody, that could lead to actual change instead of pointing all the time to the people that are actually living in those systems. And she points out, and this is for me the crux where I'm currently trying to work on. She says this all arises out of our shared worldviews, the paradigm as the almost religious pillar of our thinking. It's often unconscious and well hidden. Here it links very much to also a great book from the 70s by Ivan Illich, who calls this a radical monopoly. So the idea that we live in a world and we are so inclined to believe in the underlying paradigms of that give us this view of the world that we don't even see that this is a choice anymore. So some examples are growth is good, and growth is the only way to solve our problems. Or time is money. It's a very central one in transportation thinking. Or streets are primarily for traffic. So what she's pointing at is if we want radical change, we should try to show and to make people see these underlying paradigms, and maybe provide choices to show that these are actually choices to be made. And to do that, should we, and then we in a general sense, but also we as academics, as scholars, as social scientists, should we do that in academic peer-reviewed papers only, or should we use the mass media? And she talked a lot about the mass media. This is in the 1990s. I would say that we could easily add now social media to the mix. So should we not also, if we really want change to happen, be more out there in the debate? So go through the media, be humble, but repeatedly point out the paradigms that underlie our thinking. She says, be persistent, be an irritant, go out and keep asking questions. Don't give the answers. Don't act if you are on a moral high ground, but we are the ones that should be asking questions all the time. That's part of our job. So use social media, use the newspapers, and I think one of the the hidden messages here is also team up, because that's again something that comes out of her paper on the electronic oracle. But almost nobody is and a super modeler and a super communicator. So try to find allegiances with people and form a super team where maybe we are the good scientists and we find people that can help us to make this heard in the public debate. So this brings me to the final book that I'm not going to discuss in full. This one is available for free online, and I just advise everybody to read it. And I just want to share the key graph that comes out of it that sort of summarizes almost the entire story I've just shared with you. And that's this one. So I'm not going to completely go through all the details, but this is the understanding, a sort of systems understanding of the world, and the idea of leverages. So if you see the world, which is in itself a paradigm, but if you see the world as a system, there are many ways to change that system, to tweak it, to make it work differently. And this setup shows us that there's different powers in changing that system. So if we start on top, we have the parameters of the system. And all kinds of things like stocks and flows, lengths of delays, and so on and so forth. These are easy things to talk about. And actually, if you take this and you look at the discussions we see in the media, this is what politics is often about. It's presenting that changes to the system can only be made on the level of parameters, subsidies, taxes, and standards. And this overview shows us that although this is also the easiest way to talk about it, real change does not occur there, because this entire thinking of the parameters, the structure of the system, arise from the bottom one, paradigms. So if we do not question the underpinning values, goals, and worldviews of actors that shape the emergent directions to which a system is oriented, we are not changing anything. We are building the same factory over and over and over again on the same foundations. Today I was asked by a journalist in the Volkskrant if the corona crisis will now finally lead to cities saying goodbye to the car-dominated streets. And I pointed him to this scheme and I said, well, if we are just seeing that as a different parameter of using the street and not as a sign of the underpinning values, goals, and worldviews, then I don't believe that this will lead to a radical change of how we see, plan, and use the street. Donella Meadows says, I'm much closer to the side believing in the formative and transformative power of shared mental concepts than is popularly accepted in our own society. I happen to be a firm believer in the second law of thermodynamics, but we cannot ignore our own direct experience of system transformation brought about by thinking about something in a completely different way. Often when I present the statement that is on the screen here, it is seen as nihilistic, or is seen like literally fellow academics would say to me, this is all nice, this idea of thinking, but we also need objective facts. Understanding that objective facts can only exist in a paradigm, in a certain worldview of understanding the system, is non-trivial, and it's also not nihilistic. I think it's very, very powerful. So what I learned from Donella Meadows myself, and I hope that I transferred some of these lessons to you as an audience, is first of all, learn to see and question your own worldviews and your own paradigms in your own academic domain, in your academic life, but also your personal life. What are the unquestioned worldviews that steer us? Why are we talking all the time in circles about work pressure on the university? What is underlying that we are not actually leading to a radical redesign of the system? I think that keeping us in that questioning mode could help us to go deeper, especially in places where we are so long frustrated about a lack of change. Secondly, and this is something that I have to keep working on, is use capoeira and not karate. So keep pointing out what the foundations are, keep challenging them, be an irritant, but do not do this from a moral high ground. And as I said, this is something that sounds easy, but it's very important to be kind and empathic to the people that are stuck basically in paradigmatic thinking. You can't blame them, but you can maybe help them to see the things that they are grounded in. And use system dynamics. Use it as the anti-science, as Donella Meadows calls it. Point to complexity, show the boundaries of our thinking, and search for different system purposes. Build models together to make our thinking visible and possibly come up even with a shared new language. Social systems evolve from a shared mindset and are constrained or altered by the nature of the physical world. A system cannot be changed unless minds are changed. A system cannot be destroyed unless ways of thinking are destroyed. And if ways of thinking do change, nothing can keep the physical and social system from changing to be more consistent with the new shared reality. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the great work by Donella Meadows.
Thank you, Marco. That was splendid. We have some time to take questions, and if you want to ask a question, you can do so either using the chat function, so there are already some coming in through that function, or through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So I'm going to choose some questions that I see coming through, and if your question gets ignored, that might be because I didn't see it, but my apologies in advance. But I'm trying to keep some order to the discussion. So let me start with one of the first questions that I saw come in, and it comes from Michelle van Hulten. And the question is that is to Marco, you identify 3 subjects as the world's greatest problems, but you don't list them with population and population growth. And is this not basic to all the others, the population growth feature of the story that Donella told in the Limits to Growth work or in subsequent work?
Yeah, well, yes and no, I would say. Am I on? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So this already points out, so I think it's a very important driver of the system, right? So it's the exponential, especially back then, but also now in parts of the world, it's because the model is simplified. It doesn't look at different parts of the world. So it sees the world, also the global population as a whole. But definitely the exponential growth of the population is an important driver of the problems that arise. But also the exponential need of the population growth, and so it becomes a double exponential. But if it's a problem or not, I think, well, looking at our later work, that should be something that we should talk about, because if it's a driver, we could also say, well, we could agree. I'm not saying that I do, but you could say that the carrying capacity of the world, we should optimize for as much population growth as possible, because life is a valuable thing. So it can become a problem, but if it's considered a problem or not is something that you need to discuss. It's not something that comes automatically out of this model. The model shows that this is a very important driver of the problems we are in. If it's a problem or not, I think it's not up to academics per se to then conclude. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
And that actually feeds into a second question from Crelis Reynolds. And the question to you is about the character of systems dynamics models as opposed to economic models. And Crelis points out that the economic models tend not to have much of a feedback element in their modeling strategy, in their sort of way of conceptualizing the relations between the variables. And the question is, to what extent is that feedback strategy the key feature, and how does the position really of systems dynamics models versus economic models, how do you look at that relationship between those two kinds of modeling strategies, and also taking into account the influence that economic modeling has had? If you could say anything about that, Marco, that would be welcome.
Yeah, it's not a small
it's a big question.
Yeah. It's I'm more familiar with the transportation modeling, but it's closely intertwined. So what you can see there is that there's a trade-off, of course, between and that's also what discussed in the electronic oracle, is that we have to be very clear about what are the actual goals of the model. Is the model developed to understand the world, or is the model developed to give the desired input for policymakers to support their worldview? And well, she's quite cynical in that respect, and I'm as well, because indeed, and one example that we know from transportation modeling is that if you make traveling easier, it doesn't lead to a reduction of travel time, but over a long run creates a feedback loop, and people move further away from their jobs. Case in point is me. I live now 85 kilometers from my job. So that feedback loop is not included, but that feedback loop is known for 40 years. So it's not that it's not known, it's just not included in the models that we use to feed our policymakers. So you tend to think that adding that feedback loop and adding a system dynamics thinking would lead to a less clear input for policymakers, and they are inclined to not accept that, because a systems model, as we just discussed also with population growth, it doesn't provide in the end a clear sort of this is what you have to do to solve it, because if the world is complex, you should be much more you can have much less seeing like a state logic. That's why I referred to James Scott, is the idea that the state wants to simplify things so that they actually have a sense of control, is by definition contrary to the idea of system dynamics thinking. So that would then lead to the logic that a systems dynamics model would never be invited as a model within that state logic of thinking.
Thank you, Marco. So there are several other lines of questioning, and I'm going to follow the line that comes closest to what you just answered, and it comes from Tess Hedemans. And Tess asks how you think Donella Meadows would think about the work of Hans Rosling, the famous statistician who died recently, who promoted the use of data to explore development issues, and sort of famous for his more, in a sense, the converse kind of voice based on science, where if you look at the science, you have reason to recognize the enormous progress that we have made. How would Donella Meadows think about that work? And Tess is interested also in how you think she would think, Donella would think about this as a statistician doing a different kind of agenda, but maybe also that specific sort of Panglossian quality of Rosling's work.
My understanding of Donella's understanding would be...
No, of course you don't know, but thinking about putting on her head cap.
Yeah, I think what Hans Rosling does, he does many things, but what he does is he shows the dynamics. So he shows by showing dynamics, you already show some of the complexity of systems and how they evolve, how a system evolves. So that's one. On the other hand, I think we can, with this lens, we can also be critical about using also his own choice of variables. So he creates basically or feeds into this fact fight, right? So we can also present the world. We can also present it more positively. So that would be sort of a double, both a positive and a negative. Mm-hmm. Also positive, I would say, is that by doing so, he shows that how you look at the world is a choice. So he basically gives people enough content to become aware that it's a choice to look at the world as something that's going as increasingly worse place to live, or increasingly positive place to live. And then the last thing I would say is I think that she would be very happy with a person like Hans Rosling to present his work on podia like TED and to go through the public instead of, he could also have chosen a career of having a high H index and being the cool guy on Google Scholar. And he chose to spend his limited energy and lifetime to influence the public debate. And I think that's something that Donella Meadows would applaud. And something that I would also really that I also admire. And I'm very happy that increasingly we also do that in our department as well, that we do not only expect people to do it, but also create a system to change the variables of the system in such a way that we allow people to do it.
I think we'll have time for just a couple more questions, but let me ask one that Angie Luna just put up, which is, I think, relevant to what you just described. She asks, for a system to change, it may take years, many years, especially if you aim to change a paradigm. How do you take this into account when trying to convince, for example, politicians to include system dynamics thinking into their own work? How do you take into account that time dimension? Let me add a general gloss on her question to ask how you can use system dynamics, which often show very long-term trends, to actually influence a debate that require this sort of time horizon that seems beyond the capacity of so many individuals and certainly politicians. Anyway, how do you think about that particularly?
Well, personally, and especially due to the things that happened in the last couple of months in the Netherlands, I gave up on this. I think it was a mistake and that's also nowhere Donella Meadows writes that. I think it's a mistake to go through the politicians with this. Because, and again, they are self-selected because they are very good at seeing like a state. They simplify things, so they are increasingly good at. We see that with Corona, of pointing to a general indicator that an expert produced, and then say, okay, this is where we're going at. No vision is needed. We just go there. So that's the way that works. That's also if they would do differently, the media would slice them down. Okay, so that's again the cynical answer. But what I learned is that system dynamics can be used in two ways, and also paradigmatic work can be used in two ways. And that's I think the word educate is wrong, but to show people, the general audience. So to go through the newspapers. I just published a popular book, and much of the feedback I get from people is like, this is the first time I realize that the way that we deal with our streets, for instance, is a choice. So showing this to people, keep showing it, be an irritant, show it, keep showing it, because then they can no longer ignore it. So if people then become aware of that, they also become aware that it is a choice. There's all kinds of ways to influence that. That automatically already changes the paradigm, because it shows that there is a paradigm. So showing it, putting it in all its nakedness to the forefront, I think that's something that we can and should keep doing. And that's not per se changing it, because that's the activist attitude in me. But as a social scientist, we should show it. We should keep putting it on the surface that there are that the things that Rutte says are paradigmatic. It's impossible. And so I work a lot with the Ministry for Infrastructure, and they might be the worst in this case. And literally, they keep saying in meetings to me that, well, yeah, they say the same things. Like, well, if you want to understand and research paradigms, it takes 4 years, and we want to study the transition to sustainable mobility now, the next 2 years. So I keep telling them, so if you want that, fine, but don't expect the transition to happen. So if you want to go for something in the short run, that's fine. It's your choice. Do it, whatever you think it takes. But we have been trying for 50 years, and it didn't lead to a real transition. So if we are serious, if people talk in the language of transitions, we need to confront them with, okay, but are we really radically changing the worldviews? If not, the chances are that we are going into a transition are very, very small.
I want to ask a very easy to state question, but very hard to answer from Martin Roest. Has there been much of an assessment of the predictions that were made in the Limits to Growth report, or for that matter, the Beyond the Limits reports?
Yeah, well, I showed some of the, so they did it themselves. So after 30 years, they did a 30 years recap. Mm-hmm. And it's frightening to see the overlap of the data with the predictions.
You mean how accurate they were? So
yes, but I also see some response by Krelis Ramot, who says system dynamics also simplifies. So we should be wary of using system dynamics. The idea was not to predict, right? Yeah. It's not a prediction. It's showing if we agree on certain dynamics, and let me use another example. I'm now involved in a debate about should we have a mandatory helmet law for cyclists in the Netherlands. And there you see proponents that say, well, more helmets would protect people that fall off their bikes, and therefore we should do it because it leads to higher safety. By showing with system dynamics that there are many other feedback loops that might negatively influence safety. For instance, people seeing cycling as dangerous are not going to cycle anymore, and therefore the overall safety reduces because people do not have safety in numbers anymore. So basically saying, look, guys, it's complex. It's more complex than we are doing. So in that sense, it helps to show people, of course, we have to simplify. There's no possible system model that doesn't simplify. But it helps to show us the limits of our current simplification. So this is the system boundary, and we should try to make it visible so that we become aware of the things that are outside of the system and that lead to perverse effects.
Thanks. I want to ask a last question, and it sort of combines two questions that have come through. They will remain from anonymous question askers. And they're both really about how to practically enact some of the advice that Donella Meadows' work articulates and that you summarized for us. So one version of that is to think about how you can take the practical steps as an academic to do this better. Maybe you could answer that with respect to your own work and how you do your own work. You've already given us some answers to that. But also there's the question about what institutions or NGOs or other kinds of actors, working groups, these are the groups that are explicitly mentioned in the question, what other actors do this really well in your judgment? In a sense, carry out the Donella Meadows legacy well. And this will be our last, you get the last word. So Marco, take it away.
Yeah, so one way I try to do it is populating my newly founded chair at the University of Amsterdam with this way of thinking. And so I see it mostly, and especially the last part of her career is not, so what I could do two things, right? I can create research, create through research, I can create, because the chair is about urban mobility futures, so I can create system dynamics models and publish them and test them and improve them. But I see her work more as I can use the logic of system dynamics thinking, and especially the idea that the learning of complexity is in making the model as a working process. So I'm actually now trying to set up all kinds of workshops where you bring opponents and proponents, let's say of automated driving or bike sharing systems, I don't know, just two examples of the urban mobility future, bring them together in a room and let them create together a system dynamics model to see how they actually add to each other's understanding to create a common language. So that would be, and that's something that you can then also, of course, research, right? As a social scientist, I would be interested in how does such a process work? Does it really help to show people that there's more complexity to it? And to what kind of new insights does that lead? I hope that it leads to more humbleness in terms of things that we can do. It shows us, I think, leverage points that are much more powerful, but at the same time, it should make us humble about all the complexity that we will never catch in our models. So it will be much more about experimenting and doing things in a temporary fashion. In my line of work, transportation, this would be a radical paradigm transition. That we no longer work as this monolith building, which is actually has the shape of a traffic light of the Rijkswaterstaat building in Utrecht, and decide for the entire country. That's already, I think, part of the problem. So who's doing this well? I think currently I would give kudos to the Planbureau voor de Leefomgeving, that at least tries to take their slightly more independent role as a planbureau from the state-like seeing like a state logic, to show at least more in scenario thinking, more into showing that there are choices to be made. And so I can add there also what I think is not the right way to go currently is the presenting certain. So if we are more activist, presenting certain futures as, and then simplifying them as well. That would be a lesson from Meadows, I think, as well. So, for instance, population growth came out of limits to growth, economic growth. So it became sort of that became the new potentially damaging new paradigm. As for instance, now we see, hey, all the traffic congestion is solved because of Corona. But we now also see that what are all the negative effects of that. So it shows us the complexity instead of showing that it's a new solution. And I see a lot of that happening in, for instance, climate or ecosystems debate, which are then reduced to a CO2 logic, and then we all go, we stand behind that, which I think is always a very risky thing to do. So I would say look for social scientists, or be the social scientist that is not afraid to embrace complexity, to be humble in the face of it, and to dance. And because that's what I really like from Donella Meadows is dance, 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 or we are all lost, right? We should dance. We should create together futures. We can, but not by simplifying it into something that we strongly believe in, but instead by bringing people together, using maybe system dynamics thinking to create a better way of dealing with the existing complexity.
Thank you, Marco. That's a great way to end what was a terrific presentation and good discussion. And I want to thank everybody for participating in that and listening to this presentation of the work, Donella Meadows' work, but also especially hearing about Marco's sort of his own insight as a social scientist in this realm. Thanks for listening to the conversation. Thank you for contributing your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take all the questions. We'll find a way of getting answers. We will pass them on to Marco.
I'm easily found online,
and he's
so
easily
just
found
feel
online.
free to connect
contact
with me.
him. And mainly, of course, many thanks to you, Marco de Brömmelstroet, the cycling professor at the University of Amsterdam. And thank you, SPY 25 and the AISSR for this first online Great Thinkers. Adieu.